Yeah, welcome folks to another episode of the Speedrun. A lot going on in the chess world, but let's get back to what we're really here for. Let's get better at chess. And we have black against BT Hill from South Africa. Good luck. And looks like we have a King's Indian in the cards. Awesome. We've got a King's Indian. Okay, so we are facing a Fianchetto variation. Previously, we've only had the King's Indian in the speedrun a handful of times. And at the lower ratings, we faced, complete nonsense. I think somebody played like Bishop E3. We're at a level where if you're facing, if you're 1700 and you're facing a D4 player, chances are that they're at least going to have a legitimate line picked out against whichever opening you play. So you have to start, making sure that you're fairly well versed in mainstream theory. Now, the Fianchetto is one of the most well regarded, one of the most reputable lines against the King's Indian. It was truly popularized by Boris Averuk, who's a grandmaster, lives in Chicago. Maybe some of you watching have heard of him. He's an opening expert, and he wrote a very famous book, 2-volume series on 1d4. I want to say around 2008 or 2009 is when it first came out, right around the time the iPhone came out. And Averuk made a lot of very influential discoveries in the opening, and he basically recommended a Fianchetto repertoire, which was based on the Catalan. And to be consistent, he recommended the Fianchetto against the King's Indian. And ever since then, the Fianchetto has remained incredibly popular and one of White's best ways to fight for the advantage. So we're going to respond with d6. We're going to castle, and there's many lines that Black can play against the Fianchetto. I myself, if you look at my over the board games, I have played countless different systems against the Fianchetto. I have tried almost every available system, and at various stages in my career, I fell in and out of love with some of these systems. I'll give you guys a bit of a more expansive overview of some of the menu of options available, but we're going to play a classical system that has been around probably the longest. It's easy to learn, it's easy to understand, and while I don't think it's objectively best, I think it's a very practical way to play. It's also what I play in my my serious blitz games. So it's knight b to d7 is the first move. If you've watched my speedrun content, you should know that in the King's Indian, knight b d7 is just as, if not more common than knight to c6. Knight to c6 is also one of the main lines. It's called the Pano system, and knight c6 invites the move d5. This is the main benefit of putting the knight on d7. It's that White can still play d5, but it doesn't come with tempo. Of course, the main point of knight d7 is to prepare e5. So bishop g5 is a very common move at the lower levels. It's not very good because, well, White is not threatening to take on f6. And it's a good idea to ask the bishop a polite or not so polite question. Okay, thank you for the bishop pair. Thank you for the bishop pair. Notice that I took with a knight. And this speaks to the concept of flexibility. So you might be watching this and saying, well, why didn't you take with the bishop? Didn't you just say that you're trying to prepare e5, and now you're subverting your own idea? But the fact that White has given away the dark squared bishop has changed our perception of the board. So now we no longer should aim for e5 because we have the uncontested control of the dark squares. I think it makes more sense to carve open the long diagonal with c5. And now we've got this beautiful long diagonal. If we find a way to trade off the knight on c3, we'll have just this bishop terrorizing White along the long diagonal. So now we have a Benoni structure. And I like this move, bishop f5, preparing knight to e4. Very standard kind of maneuver. White plays knight d2. That's good. That's a good move. And notice that I'm walking my bishop directly into the path of e4, which might not make a lot of sense to you. Why am I playing for this cheap idea? White prevents it. Was bishop f5 a mistake? Not to my understanding. Because if White plays e4, if you're an actual King's Indian player, you would understand intuitively that White controlling a large part of the center is not necessarily an inherent advantage for White. And the move e4 has a lot of positional drawbacks. In particular, the knight on d2 will be left without a clear destination. It'll just be sort of awkwardly sitting there. The bishop on g2 will be even further buried behind a wall of pawns. And our bishop will just calmly drop back to d7. So we're going to play the move a6, preparing after bishop d7 to play the classic Benoni move b7, b5. This is like the very typical idea, developing massive queenside play. Knight f3. So clearly, white is preparing to counterstrike in the center with e5. And a very standard way of stopping that is to play knight to g4 and maneuver the knight to e5. Again, we're going for a trade of knights. Again, this bishop is going to be our main asset. I'm expecting f4. g4, whoa. So white is doing absolutely nothing against our main concept here, which is to play b5. Now, I think some of you watching who are in the intermediate player range, you might be tempted to play g5 here. Your logic might be, let's solidify our control of the dark squares. Let's make sure that this bishop is not kicked away with f4. But I actually think g5 is a serious mistake, and I'll explain why after the game. We are a little short of time, so I'm going to accelerate my pace here. We're going to play b5. I'm going to make a note here. 16 g5. So queen d2 hits the h6 pawn. Again, I would refrain from the move g5, and instead I would continue developing our pressure with b4. Now, as a result of b4, what move, who can tell me, what move is now available, which presents a nice way of indirectly defending the h6 pawn. And when I say indirectly defending, what I mean is you're not physically playing a move like king g7 or bishop g7. You are making a move such that queen takes h6 is ineffective. Of course, bishop b5, well done. Whenever a pawn is pushed, a square is cleared out. Rook e1. White is reinforcing the threat. Let's bring our bishop back to g7. Also, this makes sure that f4 does not come with tempo. Knight f4. So now let's bring our attention back over to the queen side. Let's ask ourselves, well, what is going to be, how do we continue, what is the next stage of our queenside play? And if you look at the arrangement of pawns, you might be really tempted to play c4, but we can't do that just yet because it drops the b4 pawn. So what seems to be a good way to prepare c4 while also improving, sort of beefing up our presence on the queen side? Well, there's a pretty obvious move here, queen a5. There are other ways that you could have done it as well. Rook a4 was very interesting too, but queen a5 is a simple move. It also creates, in some situations, the possibility of b3, and now we go and step on the gas pedal. Now here, we can close up the king side with g5, but you don't even have to do that just yet. You can play c3. Now at this point, we get a very instructive moment, because the newer players who are watching this video are probably, you're like, bishop takes e3, stop yapping and put your yappuccino aside and let's win some rooks. But I'm going to play a move that's very much in the spirit of the King's Indian, which is actually BC. And I'll explain it in more depth after the game. But see if you can understand the logic behind not playing bishop takes c3. Now I think we can play g5, just so we don't have to worry about our king side opening up. And now it's time for, let's say, the final stage of our operation on the queen side. And I would say that there's two approaches that we could take here. The first is the move bishop to a4. But if we put our Soviet sort of chess hats on, there's also a more, very like Russian way of doing this, which is queen a4. Queen a4, trading queens. And if queens are traded, white position collapses. So here we're using the queen trade as a weapon, which people forget is a thing that you can do, right? The queen trade itself can be a weapon that you use to topple your opponent's position. Now, of course, c2, the rook is actually trapped, and now it's time to take it. Now let's put the finishing touches on the game. There's many ways that we can do this. Let's involve the other rook. We can certainly put it on c8, but a more effective strategy is to put it on a8, forcing white's knight back to c1. And now you should ask yourself, if the knight moves back to c1, which I'm sure it will, what pathway does that open up for one of our pieces? Pretty obvious answer when I frame the question like that, but still. Not bishop c4. Don't fixate on the pawn. Don't fixate on the pawn. If the knight moves back, it opens up not even rook d4, not rook d4. There's an even better way to do it, folks. Not rook d4. Rook 2. So if white would have played knight c1, what would we have done? Rook to b4 is, I think, the most effective way to win the game. Rook to b4 and then rook to b1. Now, white simply gives up the pawn. I think our opponent is relying on knight d4, but That's not a particularly threatening move. Now we have many ways to win. Let's involve the other rook, rook a3. Now let's make sure that the c2 pawn is protected, and our next move is going to be rook to a1, dislodging. Actually, it's not going to be rook a1. That is a seriously inaccurate move. Never mind, it's a moot point. White just plunders the knight, and I think we'll resign the game. Hopefully, Dr. Lupo does not take over BT Hill's account at this point, although even his mastery might not help down 2 rooks. Too soon, too soon. Okay, we're up 2 rooks. I'm not going to comment on the insult people's intelligence here. We're just picking up some pawns and delivering checkmate. Classic King's Indian game. Really smooth win. I'm pretty happy with that one. Lots to talk about. I'm going to put this into ChessBase to give you some historical context. Okay. So I don't actually have the Averick books here in Charlotte. I have them back at home in California. But you can Google the 1d4 Averick books if you want to see like what they look like, if you want to order a copy. It's still, I think there were some newer editions, and it's still a very good book if you're trying to learn d4 from White's perspective. Yeah, so knight f6, c4, g6, and knight f3, bishop g7, g3. White can also start with g3. It doesn't really matter. There's a lot of different move orders. I'm not going to delve into that too deeply because we're not interested in playing the Grunfeld or the Slav. We're interested in playing the King's Indian. So these move orders that White usually dabbles with are aimed at preventing like the Grunfeld or various setups, but we don't have to worry about that. So the first time this was ever played, just to give you some sort of historical grounding, is the year, let's see. Yeah, there's thousands of games. 1923 by Alexander Alekhine. So this position was first reached, the position after bishop g2, in the game Alekhine-Thomas, just to tell you how ahead of their time the early world champions were. The second player to play this was Max Erva, another world champion. The third player was Alexander Alekhine. And the fourth player to play this line was a French player named André Chéron, who played it in 1925 in the French championship in Nice. That wasn't very nice of him to win the game fast. And White won all 4 of those games that I just mentioned. In fact, the first 5, 6, 7, 8 times that this was played, White won all 8 of those games. So this could have been called the Alekhine variation, actually. Could have been called the Alekhine, except its chess players are not known for their originality, so we decided to call it the Fianchetto. By the way, I mentioned this name André Chéron, and what he is famous for, actually, is not his playing career, but his findings in the endgame. Chéron was most famous for discovering this theme that later became one of the most important concepts in knight endgames. Let me give you an example of this. So this is actually known as the Chéron theme. Let's say, for example, this position. Now, this is not a great example because actually black can circumvent this, but it'll show you the gist of it. So this is the Chéron theme. Okay, it's a little bit, the board is a little janky, but it doesn't matter right now. White to play and win, folks. And yes, I said win. I said win. You should pause the video here, make sure that you understand why this is winning. As many of you are indicating here, it's knight takes b7, check. Knight takes b7, a6, and the knight is dominated by the pawn. It cannot move anywhere to stop the pawn. But most importantly, if black plays king c7, it says, okay, take my knight. I offer a draw. White pushes the pawn anyway. Pawn stops king b8 and promotes on the next move. It's a pretty beautiful concept, and it has many applications. It has many applications. You might think, whatever, like he discovered some like BS that I'm never going to use. No, absolutely not. This is fairly common theme in a lot of endgames. I've got an example off the top of my head. We got Dvoretsky's endgame manual here. And I know that he has a beautiful example that made a big impression on me. This is given as an exercise. It's going to be white to play and win. Here you go. It's white to play and win. White to play and win. I'll give you some time to think about it. If you're watching on YouTube, pause the video. See if you can find the winning idea for white based on what you just saw. based on Sharon's idea. So when you look at this position, what you should understand is that if you can eliminate the B pawn, the A pawn might be able to dominate the knight. So you might come up with an idea like bishop B5, let's go bishop C6, but that's too slow because the knight is able to reach D6 and it's able to stop the pawn, and the king is able to, actually you should play knight B5, the king is able to stop the other pawn, black actually wins here. But the solution is to play D6, incredible move, sacrificing the pawn, clearing the square, and you pre-move bishop takes B7. Carrying out the Sharon idea. Now, black can play knight b5, but that's losing because the knight will be tied down. Of course, the main point is that the pawn is unstoppable. Does that make sense? So that's just one of many applications of this idea. Okay, so let's get back to the game. So when this Fianchetto line was first played in the 1920s, black just didn't know how to respond, but over time, ideas were slowly being developed. Now, what are some of black's most reputable options? I mentioned knight c6, the Pano attack. I dabbled with this as an international master with decent results. Typically, if white plays knight to c3, black tries to prepare a6, rook b8, and then b5, but you have to be ready to face the move d5. And again, if you're a King's Indian player, you know all of this. If you're not, it may sound like outlandish or surprising because there's a lot of lines of the King's Indian where unless you know the move beforehand, it's not necessarily going to be intuitive for you to play this move. And here the move is knight to a5, putting the knight on the rim, seemingly at risk of getting trapped. But the point is you hit the c4 pawn, and white has various ways of defending it. Your next move is always to play c5, preventing b4, and then black, essentially just as we did, plays for b5. Another set of lines involves playing the move pawn to c6 in order to blunt the bishop on g2. This is very popular nowadays, and then you can follow up in various different ways. We played the old school line, which is knight b to d7. Now, white's standard response is knight to c3, to which we would have responded e5. Here, white's main move is to control the center with e4, and now there's a large amount of theory. There's a large amount of lines that black can play from this position. But the one that I was planning to show you guys is pawn to c6. White typically responds with a positional move like h3, and we deploy the queen to a5, which is, in my opinion, one of the most practical and exciting lines. You might have seen me, if you watch my stream regularly, my condolences if you do, you might have seen me play this against high-rated players in Blitz. I've also played this over the board in classical chess. By the way, one of the earliest games in this position after e5 is Alekhine against Reddy in 1922. And then Rubinstein-Reddy in 1922 as well. The Alekhine-Reddy game continued with queen c2, which is still one of white's most popular moves. And here Richard Reddy in 1922 plays the top engine recommendation, which still is not very well known to a lot of people. That is to play e takes d4, knight takes d4, and then to put the knight on b6. It's very rare that in the King's Indian the knight actually lands on b6, but the point here is very specific. Now, Alekhine actually realized the danger and played queen to d3. But most people, they just go b3, and they're like, you're dumb. Why would you put the knight on b6? Does anybody know why b3 is a serious mistake? Does anybody know why b3 is a mistake? And tons of people play b3. Like, if you look this position up, you will find that Hikaru has played it, Caruana has played it, Maksudlu. Tons of GMs have made this mistake. In fact, the top game in the database is Nakamura Naroditsky Bullet Championship 2024. So yes, the move b3 weakens the long diagonal, but why is it bad specifically? Why is the move b3 bad specifically? Yeah, it's because of c5. And this knight doesn't have any good squares. If it moves to b5, you chase it away. So typically white plays knight to f3, and now you pile on the pressure with bishop to f5. And now we get a very standard King's Indian idea. If white blocks with e4, you have knight takes e4. And obviously, like knight e4, bishop takes a1, and black is up in exchange. If the queen moves, then all hell breaks loose after the move d5. So modern theory, calls for the move rook to d1, which not a lot of people know. And here black is supposed to take the pawn. White tries to win it back, and we go on. I'm sure we're going to get the Fianchetto again, so I won't delve any further into the theory. White has other options as well. White can play d takes e5. This is a fairly non-threatening line. So there's a lot of theory here that we will eventually get to. Our opponent handed over a huge advantage here by giving up the bishop pair for no reason. Already, black is pretty clearly better, in my opinion, after we secure the bishop pair. And notice how we flexibly changed our plan from e5 to now the move c5. Then bishop f5, preparing knight e4, very standard idea. We provoke the move e4, drop our bishop back to d7. Probably white should try to prevent b5 by playing a4, but our opponent was kind of oblivious. And just one or two moments that I wanted to draw your attention to before we move on to the next game. The first of those was this one after g4. Why did we refrain from playing the move g5? And this is a good opportunity for you to test your sort of sense of danger. White has a very specific idea here that I find quite unpleasant. Can anybody spell this idea out? White has an idea that creates some problems for our kingside. And I'm going to check this with the computer. I'm just curious what the engine thinks here, but I don't even really care what the engine thinks. It's just bad from a human standpoint. So yeah, I played the best move, which is b5. So the answer is knight to e2. And the answer is knight to e2. And the point is white is preparing f4, which is going to potentially cause our kingside to become really weak. If we play b5, white can play f4, and I just didn't want to allow something like this. Suddenly the h-pawn is weak. Of course, black can probably get around this by not taking, but you guys get the point. There's just no need to play g5 because we are not afraid of white playing f4. We always can move the bishop to d4 or even back to g7, no problem at all. And once we expand on the queen side, the game is over. Last comment that I wanted to make here, unless people have questions. So Speed Turkey asks, anytime I play these structures, white just plays a4 and I can never seem to play b5. What am I supposed to do in this situation? So there's two answers. In this situation, you can just play rook b8 and reinforce the threat of b5. Now, often you'll find that white plays a5, but this actually doesn't help in this scenario because we play b5 anyway. And if white takes en passant, you take back with the queen. And you should remember that the point of b5, it's not just to develop a pawn storm on the queen side, although that would be nice. It's also just to open up the queen side, and you can very well attack with your pieces. If white does not play a5, let's say white plays some random move, you can play b5. And if there's a mass trade, at the end of the day, the b2 pawn is going to fall, and this bishop is going to reign supreme. And lastly, a little bit later, why did we not play bishop takes c3? Now, obviously, you should understand that both of these moves are winning. White is just dead lost in either case. But the reason is, in the King's Indian, as in the Grunfeld, you often want to be very careful about giving up your dark-squared bishop, even for a rook. Because your king becomes weak, and suddenly white's threats against the king become very real. Now, you can shut things down in g5, but white can play a move like e5. And in a scenario like this, we are a full rook ahead, but white is creating serious threats against our king. And this is a great example of this bishop being much stronger than both of white's rooks combined. Lastly, I want you guys to really pay attention to the move queen a4. This is what I call the weaponized queen trade. And so it speaks to a set of situations where people don't consider the queen trade because they associate it with a cop-out or a bailout. You trade queens when when you need to get into the endgame. But sometimes the queen trade is just as legitimate of a weapon as, let's say, a sacrifice or, a pawn storm. It's just a tool in your toolkit. And sometimes it's the only path forward. And I have an example of this. This is Naroditsky Zilberstein, 1972. White to play. What should white do in this position? Okay, white to play. It's not rook ad1. Rook ad1 is a very decent move, but it doesn't really change much. I mean, black is going to be fine in the endgame. So the move here, Now, if you think about this logically, you have a big development advantage. So logic would dictate that you want to leave the queens on the board with a move like queen to d4. The problem is black can castle, and white is also a pawn down, so the initiative fizzles out. The correct move is queen takes e7. So you're actually cooperating, doing exactly what you seem to not be supposed to do. And after king takes e7, you have an incredible shot. It comes out of nowhere, and it exploits the fact that black has no development. It's this move, knight d5 check. You're like, whoa, where did this come from? And the point is simple to observe. After ed bishop d5, the rook on a8 cannot be protected, so black cannot get 2 pieces for rook. And if it moves up, rook takes f7, picks up the rook via the skewer. So black has to, black can't even go bishop b7 because that doesn't actually help. So if black does not take the knight, then white gets into b6 with devastating effects. King to d6, knight b6 is also very bad, or even rook takes f7 here with a huge attack. So this is what I call the weaponized queen trade. Remember, the queen trade can be used in many cases to achieve your aims in a position. I got this from Lee Chess. Where is my game? There it is. And that's what we did here. Once the queen is removed, the c-pawn can move forward, and the rook on a1 is simply trapped. And here, if I would have played knight c1, rook b4, rook b1 is the simplest way to win because we can take on b3. Any questions? Any questions? Let's move on. Let's do one more 10-minute game. I know that that was pretty involved. I'm going to be quicker this time. We have the white pieces here against Insel 28 from Ethiopia. Good luck. Time for a fantasy. Okay, never mind. Black plays g6. This is called the Gurganidze system. We have faced it before on the speedrun. Now, you guys might remember that I essentially advocate for a fantasy style approach with this move f3. Now, knight to f6 is already a serious inaccuracy because it walks right into e5. Black loses a bunch of tempi and allows us to drive a wedge into the center. So f4 would be, I think, the obvious move for a lot of you. But there is also a different way that we can play this position, a much more aggressive way. Now, we don't actually have to rush the move f4. Because if you think about it, what is the drawback of f4? Well, the drawback is that this bishop is going to be like WTF. Now, what is this bishop on e3 good for anyway? What do we use it to do in these types of positions? Well, we usually use it to put it on h6 and to remove the bishop on g7. So a more flexible approach is to start with queen to d2, kind of testing black's setup. We might end up playing f4 later. We're not ruling that out, but we're creating the prospect of bishop h6 as well. Now, some of you might have been excited about like e6 here, which, yes, is a fairly standard idea, but there's no need for it here. f6. Okay, let's take it. This creates a hole on e5. It also creates a backward pawn on e7. And of course, we also should not rush the move bishop h6. First, let's assure the safety of our king. Now, you might be like, well, are we sure that the king is safe? Black is starting to attack. We need to play a3. No, we don't need to play a3. a3 is a terrible move. What we need to do is put this king on the safest possible square, which is b1. If you watch any top-level chess, you should be like fully aware that king to b1 is a very standard way to follow up on queenside castles. And this pawn storm is, it may look scary. It may seem that black is going to blow us off the board, that we should get out of bed on the king side, that we haven't started any attack of our own. It is not scary at all because it is not supported by any pieces. There is nothing to back up this pawn storm. So the pawns are eventually and very shortly going to hit an impervious blockade. There is actually no threat at all, and we can simply proceed with our aims in the center and on the king side. What are our aims on the king side? Well, I just mentioned, why did we do this? We did this to play bishop h6, removing a very important piece in the bishop on g7. Black castles. Now here we have, again, many ways that we can play this position and assert a big advantage, but let's play in the most aggressive style. As serious attackers in training, you guys should be fully aware of the standard way to play in such a situation. It is not to take on g7, because that frees up the h7 pawn, which can then counteract our own pawn storm by moving up to h5. It is, of course, to start with h4, keeping this bishop as a, laying down the wood on the h7 pawn. So black plays b4. We simply stick our knight on a4. It's a beautiful blockading square, and it's potentially a transit airport. It's a Frankfurt airport square because the knight can later move on to c5. Now, we're not necessarily trying to play knight c5 unless strictly necessary, because the knight is also fulfilling a very important job on a4. It is freezing any scintilla of hope that black may have harbored to checkmate us. We harbor more than a scintilla of hope to checkmate black, and the difference is our attack is actually going to be successful because it's backed up by a large army of pieces. Knight takes h5, and black is walking right into the lion's den, as it were. So now a lot of you, I'm positive, are probably like screaming for rook takes h5, g takes h5, and queen to g5. If black has a pawn on f7, this would have been checkmate on the spot. You must remember that if black is missing an f-pawn, this rarely works because of the move rook to f7 at the end. So just like hammer that into your mind. Instead, all we need to do to get rid of the knight is just chase it away with our g-pawn, g4. Chasing away the knight, clearing the h-file. Now, some of you might be like, well, what about knight to g3? Are we scared of this? We're not scared of knight g3 at all, because we can just move the rook up to h3. What black can trade on f1. We don't need the light squared bishop. That's not a crucial attacker. Now, of course, we replace our bishop with a queen. So the rule is you only take on g7 when you are ready to immediately establish a queen on h6. And even though I just said that we don't, strictly speaking, need our light squared bishop, it is a valuable attacker if left on the board. So a mistake that a lot of folks make had black played king g8 is to prematurely push the g-pawn up to g5. This is, in effect, the same kind of mistake that black committed on the queen side. It affords the knight a really annoying blockading square on h5. The role played by the pawn on g4 is to restrict the knight on f6 and to keep the h-file open from obstructions. Now, king f7, of course, changes the story completely because it leaves the h7 pawn without any defense. Now, of course, g5 makes perfect sense because queen takes h7 will be the follow-up, and the game is over. There is alternative ways that we can finish the attack moves like knight h3 and knight to g5. That's a slightly more advanced maneuver. It actually threatens to trap the queen in a very beautiful way. Kind of regretting not playing it, but g5 is much more straightforward. Let's take it. And now we just it's a one-man show, actually. We don't need any other pieces. Total one-man show here. Oh my gosh. So here, an instructive mistake would be to play bishop h3, which I know at least some of you are instinctively wanting to play. Don't give checks that help the king evacuate to the other side of the board. When the king is in the center, my advice is, first of all, to identify the evacuation routes that your opponent has, and to make sure, first of all, that you're not helping the king access those routes. And second of all, to see if you have any checks at your disposal that prevent the king from reaching the destination square, which in this case is c7. So one observation that I can make here is if the king lands on d6, we have this retreating check on h2, which is a really beautiful move. And actually, I think that's a far more effective way to attack than to take on g6. Rook e1 check is a super advanced attacking move, and it's predicated on this follow-up check on h2. Now, it's not the end of the story. Black has e5. And what can you guys suggest in response to e5? There's another beautiful shot that is going to end the game, and it's not d takes e5, which would be highly inaccurate as it would close up the e-file, and black would keep living. It's actually rook takes e5. Boom. And this knight on a4 will have its moment in the sun. It will have its moment in the sun because it will be the checkmating piece, knight c5. And that's poetic justice. The knight waited patiently, and it has the privilege of delivering the crushing blow. Yeah, that was cool. That was cool. By the way, none of this is new, as I'll show you. None of this is new. Wow. So just off the top of my head, one note that you guys should remember is that like when I carry out these ideas, you should understand that they're not new. They've been carried out a million times before, and this is what like pattern recognition at a high level is all about. Take a look at this game. Take a look at this game, not this game. This is the Naroditsky game that I just gave you as an exercise. Take a look at this game, which was played between two very serious players, as you will see. Extended there. So we have two very serious players. You might have heard of one or both. White is Thomas Potts, the father of Elizabeth Potts, who is one of the top female players in the world. He was also a GM. Black is Anthony Miles, the late Anthony Miles, one of the strongest GMs to come from England. Watch how Miles gets demolished here by Potts' attack. Rook e6. Miles plays f6, trying to keep the e-file close. Rook h1. Fighting for the h-file. Miles takes it. Potts gives a check on h8. And now watch White's queen very carefully how it maneuvers. Queen e1. Where is it going? It's going to h1. Miles plays king e7. He's going to try to make a run for it through d6 and c7. But watch what White does. He plays queen h5, threatening queen f7, and actually provoking the king into running. And guess what move finishes the game? What's the last move of the game, folks? Queen h2. Same concept, forcing the king back, and Miles resigned because this is simply checkmate. So what a lovely little peace path by the queen. Boom, 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 boom. Total and complete domination, total and complete infiltration. And I can give you literally like a gazillion examples of this, of the queen specifically checking on the h2 square in order to prevent the king from escaping further. Here's another simple example. This is actually quite lovely. This is from some lesser known players. 2100 versus 1700. White to play. So it's clear that White is like attacking. White has this rook on e6. And White has this prospect of taking on d6 and forcing the king into the center, but there is no follow-up. Can you find a genius move that sets up a follow-up? And Black is totally oblivious to what this move does. White plays g4. And Black thinks that White is trying to like play against these pawns. So Black plays rook f8, clearly trying to prepare f5, but no, rook d6 and the game is over. Queen drops back and the king is checkmated. Very similar to our game. And look at this. Knight takes d5, clearance, boom, 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 boom. I think this is a typo. I think it was Martin Lupo was actually the player of the white pieces. Pretty impressive stuff. So just remember, there's nothing new. If you expose yourself to enough games, you are going to learn these patterns. And you shouldn't feel discouraged if like they don't occur to you intuitively at like early stages of your chess career. So knight f6, e5 is already a good position for White. By the way, the best move for Black here is it's to play queen to b6, which is a move very few people actually know. This is actually why I like this system for Queen b6 does equalize with best play, but it is not a move that a lot of people are aware of, and so I think this fantasy setup is very practical for that reason. Does that make sense? So let me see what the current status is of this line. Queen b6, you're recommended generally to play queen to d2 and sacrifice the pawn. I'm not going to get into this right now, just because I've done enough openings for today. Big move, queen d2. I just want you guys to pay special attention to queen to d2. Now, what is the downside of queen d2? The downside is that we are allowing a move like c5, which would undermine our pawn chain. But in response to c5, we can just play dc. And if Black plays knight takes e5, then we can take on d5. Or we can play bishop to h6, which is the computer move. Again, going for that bishop trade. We don't actually even need to touch the d5 pawn. We can actually play for a quick kingside attack. So c5 is not scary at all. And after f6, you want to resist the temptation to play e6 because you're just going to end up losing the pawn. So we play ef. Probably at this point, Black should have taken with the pawn, but he took with a knight. And Black's position is already really, really bad. It's actually +2 according to the computer here, which might surprise you. King b1, simple, calm move, not fearing the move before. And hopefully you guys are able to understand why Black's pawn storm does not amount to anything tangible at all. And our attack was very straightforward, h4, etc. Now, one last note that I'll make is if Black starts with a4, if you don't feel confident going forward with your attack, you can always just play a3, drawing up the attack along the dark squares. So this knight on a4 kind of lies in wait. And as you know, it was the mating piece. Now we play h5. And the last thing that I'll note here is that if Black plays knight to g3, we have a move here that is even better than rook h3. Who can tell me how White essentially wins the game on the spot? There's a prosaic way to win material here that is actually easy to miss. White to play. Last question for you guys for today. It's just bishop takes g7, yeah, because king g7, queen h6 is out of the question. And if Black takes the rook, we take Black's rook. And at the end, we just go to g2 and trap the knight. Remember, you're not just like going for checkmate. Sometimes you just end up winning material. And here, if king to g8, there's many ways that we can finish off the attack. Bishop to d3 and bishop takes g6 is one way. You can play g5 here. That is a move that the computer approves of, as long as you follow it up correctly. Now, what is the correct follow-up here that essentially prepares to get rid of the knight? What is the most clinical move? It's a very patient move. It's a very patient move. It's bishop to d3, setting up the threat of rook h5. And of course, setting up a secondary threat of bishop takes g6 with very simple lines here. Check and checkmate. Now, a lot of you guys impatiently would take on h5 and play g6. I've seen people do this all the time. And you have to be very careful about like overdoing it, because g6 grants Black the f6 square. And suddenly, if you take on h7, the king feels very comfortable on h8 using the pawn as an umbrella. But don't sacrifice unless you see a path forward. Black has nothing going for him. So like these patient moves, bringing pieces out, can go a very, very long way toward avoiding unnecessary complications. Speaking of unnecessary complications, of course, like queen takes g6 is also winning on the spot. But I decided to win the game with a flourish. Rook takes e5. And we can also play bishop h3, but that prolongs the game due to rook f5. Look at this lovely mate in the center of the board. Also, I'm sure I could find analogous examples of mates in over-the-board chess, just off the top of my head. Yeah, here you are. Look at this. Look at this game. Yeah, this is just some random game from two English players. White is already completely winning, but White wins the game with queen to e2, then delivers a check on e5. And after king to d7 plays a move that I really like. He does not play queen takes e6. He plays knight takes e6. Now, the knight has two different directions that it can go to, so the bishop is untouchable. Black plays knight e8, and now the knight drops back to c5. And this is a forced mating sequence that ends the game. All right, last 5-minute game, just because people have been so supportive. Let's finish with a blitz game. All right, we have a game here. We have Black against a 2100, so let's focus up. Now, as you know, one of the benefits of the King's Indian is you can play it essentially against any White setup. Another Fianchetto setup. Of course, this one is in English. It's not actually a Fianchetto variation because White's pawn is located on d3 rather than d4. Now, one thing that I will mention to sort of the higher rated crowd is that you should not treat the King's Indian setup as a dogma. So like, is there anything wrong with playing d6 and e5? No. You can play d6 and e5. You can play a King's Indian setup against the English. But there is a very effective way to completely neutralize this line that English players hate facing. And that is actually to play c6 and d5. Just essentially getting a heavily improved Grunfeld. White plays the move d4, and we have essentially transposed to a Grunfeld with colors reversed. So we are essentially playing White. The potential downside, of course, is that we have been move ordered, one can say, into one d4 opening, which maybe you don't play. But still, you really cannot complain because essentially you're playing with the white pieces here. And this completely symmetrical position is very well known. It's been heavily studied and it is equal, but generally white, and I say white because again, remember, usually you get this with white against the Grunfeld. White has a lot of attempts to make black's life very difficult indeed. And one of those attempts is this immediate knight jump to e4, creating some nasty tension against white's knight. And if the knights are traded, then white deals with the weakness of the d4 pawn. Now we go for a positive pawn structure transformation, and we are essentially playing to control all of these light squares and keep the c pawn at bay. So knight to h4, bishop drops back to e6. Very instructive square. You should pay attention to how the bishop will remain on that square in order to discourage white from playing c4. Now we're going to pile up on the c pawn even further with the classic maneuver knight to a5 and potentially knight to c4. And now we have complete control of the game. Let's play b6, making sure that this rook does not bother us at all. Bishop f5 was also possible, probably even more precise. That move isn't going anywhere. We can play bishop f5. The bishop has done its job. And this is the phrasing that I like. The bishop has done its job on e6. It's time to optimize its placement. And also, it's a good idea to coordinate the rooks with queen to d7. You never know when a move like queen to a4, queen to b5 may come in useful. My guess is that our opponent will start getting impatient and will start trying to generate activity, thereby making his position even worse. Let's go bishop h3, eliminating white's only active piece, which is the Fianchetto bishop. Once it is eliminated, white is left with this piece of garbage that it would be an insult to bishops to call it a bishop. Now, white tries to redeploy the knight to f4. You should pause the video at this point and ask yourself, how would you deal with the, I don't want to say threat, knight f4 is not a threat, idea of knight f4. Would you prevent it, and if so, how? Or would you allow it? Now, think about what your instincts are here. So if you wanted to prevent it, you could play the move g5. As I mentioned in a different situation in the earlier game, you want to be very careful about such moves because they are quite weakening. So I'm actually going to completely ignore, I'm going to laugh in the face of white's idea. And what I want people to understand is that oftentimes when your level in chess improves, you start realizing that not all ideas have to be prevented. Like prophylaxis doesn't need to be overused, and you should evaluate whether an idea is actually dangerous before you decide to prevent it. Like, yeah, the knight has gotten to f4, congrats. Yes, white threatens two pieces at the same time. Okay, we bring the queen back, we defend the d-pawn. The knight on f4 is not exerting any relevant pressure on its own. And later on, we can chase the knight away with moves like g5. So oftentimes, allowing your opponent to execute ideas is actually much more effective than preventing them at the cost of your positional advantage. Let's continue playing like a Russian schoolboy, and let's continue operating on the queen side. We want to double rooks on the c-file. We're obviously going to play e6 when the time is right. My guess is our opponent will go like knight b4, knight f4. And at that point, we will solidify our vice-like grip on the position with the move e6. Okay. We don't need to play it just yet then. Rook fc8. Okay, now we move on to the next stage of the positional assault. First of all, it's a good idea just to prevent e4. We bring the knight back from c4. At some point, when you are fighting against a backward pawn, you need to transition from blockading it to actually winning it. Like, you actually do need to win that pawn eventually, and we are doing that by moving the knight from c4 to e4. Now we have three attackers on the pawn. White cannot defend it. And once the dam breaks, this extra pawn, because it's an endgame, is going to be decisive. It's going to be completely decisive. Now the win is a matter of simple technique. White has a choice here between trading off all of the rooks or allowing our rook to access the a3 square. White chooses the second option. Now the e3 pawn, I'm also keeping an eye on. We could play bishop h6, but there's no reason to do that because of f4. What I like here is a strategy of playing e6. Never hurts to protect that pawn, and then bringing the bishop into the game via f8. And then we go bishop b4 check, using the weakness of the e3 pawn to push the king further away from the battlefield. And now the winning idea here after king e2. We want to get rid of the knight. How do we do that? By bringing the bishop to b2. And white is totally powerless against this idea. Now, there were other ideas that could be implemented here. You could also like push the pawns forward and eventually just create a passer. That's also viable. You could bring the king into the center. White is so tied down that there isn't like one winning idea. I think this is the fastest though, because you're just directly going for the a2 pawn. Clinical, I mean, you can just totally ignore what white is doing, completely ignore. There's no actual threat to any of our pawns. White cannot go rook f6 because the knight will be lost. Now we play rook takes a2, very important. White still cannot play rook f6 because of the discovery. My guess is our opponent will go knight to b4 and then try to, no, white takes on b2. Okay, that's obviously very cooperative. And white wants to go rook f6. A little bit of calculation doesn't hurt, but I'm just going to go with my intuition. Our pawns are so fast that by the time white gets a rook behind the pawn, it's going to be on a2, and it's going to be way too late for white to do anything. So we're going to go a3. Yeah, white gets the rook behind the pawn. Congratulations. Now we can play a2 here. That's one option. But if we play a2, white could maybe get the king over to b3. What is another way that we can essentially keep our pawns moving and keep white's activity at bay? Who can tell me a second way that we can win this position other than a2? Well, no, b5 blunders the pawn. So what do we need to do first? Well, we do not play rook a2. Whatever you do, don't play rook a2. Don't put the rook in front of the pawn. Put the rook to the side. Again, we're using the e3 pawn as a major advantage because the king cannot go to c2. Now we push b5. We bring the pawn up to b4. Then we go back to b2. And then the pawns in snake-like fashion are going to snake up the board. We can take all the time that we need because white has no way to generate activity. Okay, big deal. Ooh, scary. h5. Time to resign. That's it. I mean, this is too much to handle. And a2. Now, actually, apart from b3, we have an even faster way of winning the game. Who can tell me? Okay, let's get the king out of the danger zone. Who can tell me, other than b3, what is an even more efficient and effective way to promote the pawn? This is very important for people to know. It's to play rook b3 check and then rook a3. And if white takes, the doubled pawns stop white's king from accessing b2. It's a lovely little theme that has won a lot of games. And sometimes it's actually the only way to win. In this case, we had the luxury of also being able to play b3. But if it's less one-sided, you should know this concept. And white resigns. GG. Simple, easy win. All right, I'm really tired, guys, so I'm just going to limit myself to a couple of comments. You can definitely take a look at this game on your own. But first of all, notice the move c6. Now, white typically prevents black from playing d5. White's standard move here is e4, getting what's called the Botvinnik setup, and then we can go back to a King's Indian setup if we want. But if white allows d5, then white has lost all hopes of fighting for an advantage. And then I said that this position usually arises with colors reversed. What do I mean by that? Well, typically, if we get a Fianchetto King's Indian, black has the option of playing c6, then d5, and we have gotten exactly the position from the game if white plays knight e5, except with colors reversed. In the game, we had this position. So sometimes, like, if white plays e3 and then plays e4, you're playing like a Ruy Lopez with colors reversed. And what you will find is that it can actually be very hard to remember the theory when the colors are reversed. Like, psychologically, you're so unused to seeing the position with colors reversed, it can be hard to like remember what the moves are. But this is not one of those instances because the position is so symmetrical. So white actually has to know a lot here to preserve equality. The correct move here, I'm going to double check, for white is bishop f4. Bishop f4 is the best move. And then black can play, let's see, knight takes c3, b takes c3, bishop f5. Actually, we would play the same way that we played in the game. e3 is a really bad move because it keeps the bishop passive for the rest of the game. Now we have domination over the light squares, and the bishop drops back to e6. Very important idea. Not only does this overprotect the d-pawn, but this prevents c4, and it also discourages e4, because then the bishop can be redeployed to d5. So that's a big takeaway. Then we played a bunch of simple moves, allowing your opponent's ideas to happen, again, using the queen trade as a weapon, and then transitioning from blockading a pawn to actually winning the pawn, tying down our opponent's defenses, activating our last piece, and simple logical thinking to eliminate the final defender. And that's all I have to say, guys. That's where we'll end. Hope you guys enjoyed the games. I'm happy with this episode. I think this one was better than the last few, so hopefully we can come back to feeling a little bit more inspired. Hope you guys learned something. A lot of negative stuff going on in the chess world. Hopefully this is a little bit of a break from all of the drama. Dr. Lupo cheating scandal, and let's not forget why we're here. Ultimately, we're here to learn and become better at chess on our own. And that's infinitely more satisfying. Thank you, folks, for the support. I will try to stream Freestyle Friday tomorrow, but no guarantees. If not, I will stream this weekend. See you guys later. Thanks for hanging out. Be safe. Be well.